All right, guys, let's talk about materials. Being able to successfully, artistically express the difference between things is important, but to get there, we need to be capable of discerning the differences between them. So that means understanding the key visual properties of different materials is a critical and very useful skill that will help you sell the ideas and believability of whatever you're trying to create. Being able to do this is aided by your ability to see these properties when you look at different surfaces. So in order to be able to recreate something that looks like wood or stone or cloth, we need to be able to look at it and understand the differences between them. We look at one thing and say, okay, well, what makes that wood? What makes that cloth? And even more particular, when we get into it, because there's lots of different types of these materials, what makes that particular one? So my goal with you in this video is to be able to walk through and express how to look at things to be able to tell the different properties of them and then successfully recreate them. So I have a bunch of examples I just want to walk through with you, and we'll look at them and we'll talk about what makes them what they are. So right off the bat, starting with a huge different palette of things to look at here. So we have wood, we have glass, there's wine in the glass, or juice, some cloth like a shirt of some sort. I believe this is onyx, some stones, leather. You got a plastic bottle here, metal, iridescence, some kind of claw, amethyst, a topaz, a stone. So as you can see, a huge range of materials. And there's many more than this too. These are some of the more common ones that we want to go through. And as you're making assets and creating objects, scenes, characters, whatever it is you want to do, chances are you're going to have one or more of these things represented in your scene. And so you want to be able to put down with confidence something that looks like what you were trying to do. And so let's take a look in between these. And so I'm not going to go into them in too much depth, but I want to point out, the stuff we want to look for in general, right? So for example, right off the bat, if we look at the wood next to the glass, the one thing that jumps out immediately is glass has this huge reflection on it. Whereas you can see wood here, it's pretty flat, honestly. And that would be, I would say, the number one thing to look for when you're looking at a material is what's the specularity like? Is there things being reflected off of it, right? Because you could see immediately here with the leather that the light is kind of shining back. You don't see it as much. Obviously, it's lit. The rock is lit, but it's not as evident here. Whereas with both the glass and the plastic bottle, there's a nice strong highlight there, right? So that's the other thing. When you're looking at these, is it shiny? And then how shiny, right? So there's some things like the leather has that reflection, but it's not quite as bold as, I'm going to grab another layer here, not quite as bold as the plastic bottle, right? If we're looking at the color, it's brighter than the base part of the shoe, but it still doesn't come close to the plastic bottle, which is a very bright, oops, undid it. It's a very bright reflection. And so right off the bat, that's the first thing to be aware of when you're looking at these things is how's the reflection. The other kind of things you want to look for is, well, is the reflection like dirty or not, right? In this case, if we look at the claw here, what I mean by dirty is there's a lot of scratch marks and stuff in there, right? And that has to do with the surface. So by having that kind of thing represented in your texture, you're selling the actual surface of the material even better because this is reflecting color and it's pretty bright, right? That's the other thing to look at is that not only is it reflecting a pretty bright highlight there, and the fact that it's scratched up a little, which is going to show inconsistencies in the actual surface itself, right? There's going to be scratch marks and it's not going to reflect the light directly back at us like this. So we see those cuts. And we want to keep in mind too how sharp the reflection is. So in things like metal, at least clean metal and glass like this, because the surface, something like glass, is very smooth, the reflection is going to come back crystal clear like this. Whereas, as we saw here with the claw, that surface itself has all these little ridges and bumps in it that are going to make the light on those ridges point a different direction. And so we're not going to see them from this angle, and that's what causes that. And so the more imperfections that a surface has, the more that reflection is going to come back muddied or diffused. So same with the plastic here. It's a very smooth bottle, so it's coming back like crystal clear. It's super sharp. And we look over here at the leather, and it's pretty nice reflection, but you could see there's like hot spots, and then they get less hot as it falls off. So because the surface is a lot, grungier and dirtier, when you zoom into it, right? If you went to a microscopic level, same thing as the tooth or claw, but on a much more extreme level, right? So when the light is coming in, it's bouncing all kinds of different directions. It's going to go this way, it's going to go that way, and so it's diffusing the light. Whereas with the glass and metal and such, it's such a polished surface that it's coming back really strong highlights. So, okay, now that we understand that, there's a couple other things right off the bat that we want to look out for. The next thing would be the contrast. So we have this highlight, but we also have a dark shadow. And metal is really kind of well known for this. This is a property that we see a lot in like pewter, metal, copper, anything of that sort is going to have a very strong contrasty kind of reflection because, again, the surface is so clean and smooth that we're going to get back. It's almost, it is a reflection, right? It's just distorted by the shape of that object. And so right away, you want to paint convincing looking metal, just bump up your contrast right there. And so that's another thing to look at when you're making your material. Okay, how high is the brightest bright versus the darks? And it's going to depend for metal a lot on the environment they're in. But in general, you're going to see a lot more contrast in that. And we'll go through that in a second. But I just wanted to point out basically the biggest things to look for when you're evaluating materials. Again, we could look up here at the shirt. This is the shadow side and this is the lit side. Not a huge difference in color. Very kind of narrow range. And this is something that if we want to paint a shirt, if it's cloth or cotton or whatever this might be, now we know, okay, I need to keep my value range narrow, right? And all this is going to really depend on the light you have in the scene too. In this case, a lot of this stuff is lit with a bright, like kind of skylight, or in some cases, like a photography environment where they'll have just a big bright light shining on the subjects. This would be, outside. And so the light is going to change what color your reflection is. And so in this case, it's white. But if we had a colored light in the scene, like in this example, we look at the glass and you have two types of reflections here. We have the reflection from the windows in the room that this was taken in, but then we have these blue lights coming in here from the lights in the bottle, and we could see them on the glass, and they are reflected back as the color they are, which is blue. And the thing to keep in mind here is that not all surfaces or materials will do this. Some will reflect back different colors. They're rare cases, but they're out there. So that's another thing to look for when you're trying to recreate a specific material is that, okay, what color is it reflecting? And there's a couple cases that we'll talk about. One of them is actually right here. And that's going to be iridescence. So it's actually reflecting back different colors depending on how the angle you look at it is. So it's kind of a really neat effect, pretty unique. And then there's also pearlescence, which will reflect back similar to kind of the pearl colors. It's going to be like pastel, blues and pinks and stuff like that. You'll see like some cars will have that effect, or other kind of jewelry or cups exist out there with that. But I thought this would be a nice, good range of examples to start with. But let's go a little further, right? So just because we said wood had a pretty narrow range, right? It's not very shiny here, but that can all depend. It really depends on how the material is treated. So this is what I was saying earlier, where even if you're just doing wood, well, then you have to ask yourself, if you're creating something from scratch from your head, is like, okay, well, what kind of wood might this be? Is it going to be new? Right? Did someone just build this? Did they polish it? Did they paint it? The paint itself will have a specular quality to it that you're going to want to represent properly. And so we could see immediately a difference here from this one, is that this is already getting the reflections from whatever other room or outside, or if there's a light over there. And that's actually quite shiny, right? However this wood has been treated is allowing it to shine back and reflect the light in a different way. And so if you want to create a room that was, fairly new and treated, you might have to keep that in mind when painting the floor. Whereas over here in some of these other examples, it's a lot more diffuse in terms of you're not seeing the light source really. You're seeing that it's lit, and it might be lit from a cloudy day. It might be lit just from, a fluorescent bulb above, but we're not getting a good indication really of that light because it's so spread out. And again, this is because of the surface itself having lots of undulations in it and being rough. So roughness is actually a term used when discussing different like specular properties of surfaces, talking about, if the surface, as we discussed before, how rough it is really. So is it clean and polished, or is it going to have lots of little bumps and cracks and crevices, which is going to scatter the light, making it go all different directions and having it kind of look a lot softer here. So again, this is different kinds of wood, and even in the case you have bark and you have trunks themselves, and you see almost no light reflected back. Some types of trees, you might get a specular reflection back. This is why reference is really useful if you're trying to replicate a certain type of tree, or really want things to stand out and look different. So that's really good to look for. Another thing you want to keep in mind when making materials, especially for something like wood, is you're going to keep in mind the local color of something. And what I mean by that is, I guess the best example I give is if it's unlit, or if it's in like a cloudy environment where there's like no real hard color being thrown onto the surface, right? You're not under like a red stoplight, or it's not like super bright and yellow sunny out. There's always going to be some kind of color on your surface due to whatever the nature of the light itself is. Even when you're outside in the sky, it might have a slight blue tint depending on where you are, if you're in the shade, stuff like that. But by the local color, I'm talking about like these shapes and colors here. It's like the wood staining in this case. So when you're recreating material, you want to ask yourself, what kind of like patterning or look is present in that material? And in this case, depending on the type of wood, right, you have these different kinds of shapes that the bark kind of grows into. Right here on the wood itself, right, you have all these cool looking shapes of the planks, the grain. How might that look, right? And so you want to represent that, and that's going to be separate from the shine, from the specular to a certain extent. But if they raise up, then you might need to hit a highlight here or there depending on where the light is and how shiny you want that wood to be. But that kind of thing, when you're making a texture, a material, you want to say, okay, what kind of surface quality does it have, as far as just like purely the color, not even things shining back. And so you want to paint that in, and you want to make sure you have that represented, right? If it's going to be this kind of hardwood floor, make sure that you color it in a way that's consistent with what that material would be in the real world, if you want it to read that way. Obviously, you can deviate, creative license. If you want it to look a specific way, that's fine. But if you want people to understand that it's this material, okay, well, it looks like this type of plank has these rectangular, the way it's cut up is very small slats of different types of wood, right? So you're getting almost like planks within planks. So make sure you pay attention to that kind of stuff. Get the shapes to read like they do when you look at them, and kind of analyze. Okay, well, they're kind of right. They're like swoopy shapes. Let me get a lighter color there. They're like very swoopy shapes here, right? A lot of times they like knot up. So you try to, when you paint these, try to recreate the kind of shape language here. If it helps, go through and trace it, right? Sometimes you see it knot around. And so feel it out. Get a handle on how it's actually flowing. You know, a lot of the bark here, you get these twisty, cool, gnarly shapes with this crisscross. So moving on, another one that has a different kind of specular feel is gold. Gold is actually a material that reflects back a colored light. So even if you're shining like white on it, it's going to come back with a color in its specular. So that's really good to know if you're trying to make convincing gold. Try not to go straight to white. You know, you're going to hit a color along the way, and that's going to make it feel more like gold. Look at some different leather here. Leather's another one like wood. You know, it can have a lot of shine depending on how it's treated, or not. A lot of this is going to be generally more shiny depending on how worn the leather is. But you could see kind of pretty bright to pretty dark. So leather can shine back a little more than wood, but you're going to want to look at the type of leather you're looking to create. And then keep in mind, again, how the surface of it is, because you're getting this really soft highlights. It's not like the wine glass where it was really tight, right? It's really soft. And then the other thing, as we were talking about with the wood, is what's the local color? Well, in this case, the color of the leather typically has a lot of like veins and stuff in it, right? So if I put like a little swatch down, there's a lot of these like little squiggly vein things, which a lot of times are indents, but sometimes there's just staining too. And so just by putting in a lot of surface variety, it could sell. Oopsies, I got a weird brush there. It can sell that material a bit better just by having, you know, a lot of different colors. It's not a flat color here. If we look in, even just right here, there's red, and then there's, you know, the little desaturated tone, and you're going to get a bunch of different tones in there. So try to represent that. Go in up close to some leather pictures and just take a look at the surface. It's really noisy here too, right? So there's lots of speckles, there's lots of different shapes going on there. It's kind of a noisy environment. Going over here too. See that? Like that's almost looks like a clouds filter in Photoshop or something, right? It's a very noisy texture. And so leather tends to have that qualities, as well as the edging being a bit brighter, right? So we look over here. It gets pretty hot on the edges. That's it happens pretty often with leather. Down here you could see it too, right? And where it's worn, it's getting a bit brighter. You'll see that a lot. Now back to metal. Again, we were talking about contrast, and immediately you can see it in some of these. It gets really hot and then really dark. And that's because of how well the metal reflects the light. And so same thing here. You get these really bright highlights followed by lots of contrast. And it's gonna sell your material if you're able to recreate that. Even just right here on the helmet, like look at that. Look at the difference right there. If I just take that white and move it across, it's right up against these dark colors. Same with something a little more rough, like the pipe here, but the contrast is still there. You still got the light to dark being a lot tighter, and that highlight too. It's a little rougher than the other one, so you see it kind of soften, but it still feels like that material. And up here too, a good example of you get these little hits. And remember, each of these are actual lights. They're lights in the environment itself. So that's another thing to keep in mind is where's your light in your scene? If you're going to be painting these, you need to know where the light's going to be hitting it and how many lights, right? You could kind of BS stuff and still make it look right, but it's going to be more believable if you can say, okay, I'm going to have a light over here and it's going to cast down. And so we have boom, boom, right? And there could be a secondary light kind of coming in and doing like a fill to give it a little more interest. But in general, those are the kind of things you're going to want to keep in mind while doing this. Cloth, again, we have kind of like cotton and stuff that we talked about and how low contrast they are between like the highlights and I guess the mid-tone and shadows. So when you're doing it, have your reference up, be like, okay, am I making it too shiny? Because in that case, it might make it feel like a different type of cloth, a different material. And right here we have like, I believe it's either velvet or satin. And I believe this is velvet. And so what's happening here, right, is it's reflecting back its own color. This isn't reflecting white. It's reflecting back the color of the material itself. And so this is a pretty unique property for this type of material. So the reds are just getting exaggerated and really colorful, really saturated, which makes it look like that material. Like, look at that. That's really cool. And that's not happening with these other ones. This is actually getting whiter, right? It's taking the color that's hitting it and it's absorbing that, whereas this is boom, it's super bold. It's really cool. And so let me show you some examples now of like in art. These people have like mastered it. So I'm a big fan of Sargent, so I put in a couple of his paintings here too, but you can see the understanding of the material and like how he handles the highlights and the shadows, even with the cloth here, right? Look at the difference again in contrast, how much the light is hitting it and the shadows versus being in full light, where you see the specularity or not. Like, there's a great example here on the gold, right? So if I can get a brighter brush for you up here, like the highlights are super tight. They're just kind of speckled in. You see the dark in between, but it's selling that material really well. You can tell it's like this little thin strips of gold. Same over here on her kind of thing she's wearing on her head. It's beautiful. And boom, you see like her gown that she's wearing, very, very sharp specular colors, kind of cutting through, but it tells you like, well, that's a very shiny dress, and we get a feel for what that would be. It's certainly a lot different than this over here, what she's wearing. And we can do the same thing. It's kind of what we want to accomplish when we're making art. Is like, you look at this guy. I love this painting. And look at the difference with how his cloak is treated versus the shield. You see how tight this specular highlight is, right? It's all localized like right here. Whereas it's spread so evenly on the cloak, you can't even really tell. It's lit, but you don't see a highlight like that. So that's how we're going to tell the difference visually between something that's really hard and shiny versus like matte and soft or rough. Even his skirt, very different feel from the cloak. And so this kind of stuff is really cool to see. Right here, again, this wood, beautiful. and it has a slight specular to it. You can tell it was like a little polished, right? It's a smoother wood that maybe was treated. Still old, has lots of different kind of like, maybe it got burnt here. It's telling a story, but it still feels like wood. And this is done by observing life. And you're seeing, how did it get this way? What is causing it? Try to understand the material you're looking at. And the more you understand, the more it's going to be easy for you to kind of recreate those things and to sell what you want to sell the viewer, right? So, I mean, look at that, the coat he's wearing. The way the light hits it, it's very diffused. You don't see it any kind of shine. It's because we could tell it's like really soft, right? The way the light is hitting it and it's picking up some of the color from the sky. It's beautiful. And so when you're doing this, I want to just kind of go over it one more time. If you have to ask yourself questions when you're making something and you're kind of having trouble determining, what is it? Why doesn't it look like that yet? I'm painting this material and it's not quite there. Again, ask yourself, what's the local color of it? If there was no spec, if you could remove the specular highlight, what's local color and patterning and whatnot, as we talked about with stuff like the wood, or even right here, you can see in this claw, it's going from this light cream down to this kind of dark color. And so you could get that in, try to see it separately from the highlight. So you paint that and then you say, okay, now I see how the light's hitting it and it's brightening it up there, and kind of feel the difference. So it's like, okay, what's the local color? And then what's the specular color? In a lot of cases, it's going to be a lighter color of it, depending on the color of the light itself. And then how strong and tight is the reflection itself, right? Is it very soft, like something here, or like you don't even see it in the wood and the rock because it's so diffuse, because the material, again, is very rough. So you think about touching the material, what's that feel like? Chances are it's going to have a huge impact on how the reflection of light is handled. Just look at the difference between the materials and kind of visualize that. Again, so like with glass, super tight and bright. Here, not so much. So how strong and how tight is the reflection itself? And then if the thing is see-through, is there an object or color or something behind it that's influencing what you're seeing? Up here with the wine or the juice, that's changing kind of how, it's a different color here now. That's important to take into account. Sometimes there might be something behind it, like a book or a bookshelf or whatever, and that's going to get distorted by the glass, and we need to look at it carefully and determine what's happening. Same with the top of the liquid here, a different color than the base. And so keep that stuff in mind. And I think just recognizing it and noticing it is going to be really powerful into being able to recreate it and get it to look like the material it is. That way, when you show someone the work you've done, they could point to different parts of it and understand it and say, oh yeah, that's this and this is that, and it makes sense to me visually. And you can sell your artwork a lot better like that, and it's going to make a big difference. So I'm going to do a couple examples of these in the next video.